Hi, and thanks for taking some time out to drop by Visual Art Photography Tutorials, where today we have a really interesting project for you. What we're attempting to do today is come up with images that are very tranquil, and we're going to be using water and rocks in combination to achieve that goal. Now, you could be going by a lake, or it could be by the ocean. And there are two different ways to look at it, because the lake tends to be a little bit more level in terms of the water than the ocean, which tends to move around a bit more and have tides bringing the water in and out. And at the ocean side, basically you want the lower tide. But anyway, the idea is to have the water very, very quiet, but it isn't always that way, and there are different ways to get it the way you want it. Now, you are definitely going to need a tripod, and I suggest that you have a focal range somewhere between 24 millimeters and 200. You may not be able to get as close to the rocks as you want. That's why you may need to reach out a little bit more with some telephoto distances, okay? So that's what we're going to go for today. We're looking for images that you would feel you might want to print and hang on the wall, something that when someone looks at it, they get that feeling of serenity, of peace, of tranquility. So we've got three fantastic tips today for you, tips that will help you create some really tranquil images. As usual, comments and questions can be addressed down below. Let's get out there with our tripods and cameras and make some great images.
So we have three big tips to make your artistic landscape photography look quiet. We're looking for the quiet landscape here. And tip number one, use long exposure photography. Bring your tripod along with you, and if you have to, as I did in this particular case, use a neutral density filter to make your exposures 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds long as you'd like. What happens is it smooths out the water. The rocks are static, they're not moving. Now in this particular shot, there wasn't a lot of movement in the water. It actually looked like this beforehand, so there wasn't a lot of motion. But by making a 10-second exposure, I got something like this. And it just really makes everything look still and very, very quiet. Same thing here. Now, you're still seeing some motion. I used I think it was about a 6 or 7 second exposure. I was using a neutral density filter. By the way, you can really help yourself a lot with this type of photography by putting your aperture, say, at f16 or f22. That will give you a long exposure. It may even be long enough. It may give you a second or two. If you want to go longer, use the neutral density filter, and then you can take it into the realm of 10, 15, 30 seconds, things like that. So you still have a little bit of motion, but things are really softened up a lot, and you get that static. Look at this, look at the rock here, and look at over here, and there's no movement. You get that quiet feel. Same here. This is a 20-second exposure on this overcast day, and it almost looks like you're looking into some soft clouds, which basically you are, because this is what was being reflected. On top of that, you have this plant over here with the icicles, and that just adds even more to the idea of the whole thing being static. But that was a 20-second exposure. Okay. Now, again, another 20-second exposure. Everything is extremely smoothed out in the sky, so another long exposure photo. But now we're going into tip number 2, use negative space. You've got this little rock on the side, and everything else is wide open space. That can really add to a feeling of static. It can really add to a feeling of quiet. Look how quiet this photo looks. This one doesn't look so quiet, and I'm showing you this because this was shot at 125th of a second, and it's basically the same type of thing as this. It's just a little rock, but now you're seeing ripples in the water, and it may be nice, whatever, but it's not as quiet as this. It's not as static. Now, to go completely the other way, you look at something like this. Now this is nice. It's showing rushing water. It's a relatively long exposure. It's a couple of seconds. It's showing you the water coming through, but you know it's not quiet. You know the rocks are static. You know they're not going anywhere, but you also know that that water is making noise. You mentally know this, and you see the rushing part. So while it may or may not be nice, it's not quiet. It doesn't feel like that. It's a big difference between this and this. All right, so that's tip number 2. Negative space, and you've got a long exposure here too, so that was tip number 1 for that feeling of quiet. Now, let's go to something else. This is a little bit of an aside. It's not really a tip. It's just something to look out for in your photography. This is being shot late in the afternoon, early evening, and you've got these warm tones on the rocks, and you've got the cold blue tones in the water, and something about warm and cold just really works in photography. It's just a great feeling. So anyway, look out for that. All right. Now, tip number 3, silhouettes. Silhouettes are great. Now you can see a little bit into the rock here, but basically these are silhouettes, and certainly the shadows that are being cast by the rocks are completely black. Don't be afraid in your photography, once in a while, or as often as you want, to let things go dark, to let things go black. Now, in this particular tutorial, we're talking about using rocks by the water's edge as a way to make a quiet landscape. This looks quiet, and that's because silhouettes and silhouetted rocks really look dramatic, they really look static, and they have that heavy feeling that suggests a lack of movement. They're not going anywhere, and it's quiet, and the color all works together. Look at this one. There's a little more movement in the water. I shot this actually at 1/2000th of a second. All right, so this was stopped quickly. So you see the little bit of movement that there is, but it almost looks like glass, right? But look how dark the rocks are, the 2 rocks. They've gone completely black. Don't be afraid to let that happen. Okay, it may not always be what you want, but it can also add a very, very dramatic effect, a very, very static effect, a very quiet effect. This one is not quite as quiet as this, and that's because of the motion in the water. There's a little more here, but it's still pretty quiet. Again, this is gone. I turned this to black and white. Don't be afraid to let the weight of the black make that image really, really quiet. Look at this. It was shot at 1/160th of a second, I believe, so everything was stopped and still. It's not a long exposure. The blades of grass aren't moving. The rock certainly is not moving, but it's the weight of the rock. It's that darkness that it's just heavy, and that creates a feeling of static. And finally, not really a tip here either, but you may want to incorporate some reflections as well. It also works here because you have the leaves that are on the left, they're not moving because the exposure was not a long exposure. And you have the rocks at the very bottom, but you have that other one that your eye is always going to, and then you have the reflections. It's kind of busy, but you have a main tree trunk over here on the right, and that's leading you down into the rock and up as well. So you definitely know what your eye is going to look at. It's going to look at the rock. It's also going to look at the leaves a little bit. But there you have it. 3 tips. Long exposure, negative space, and underexposure for silhouettes.
I hope that whet your appetite for tranquil images of water and rocks. Until next time, I'm Ray Scott reminding you it's not what you see, it's how you see it. And I'll see you soon.